Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to the City of London.
The City of London.
The next station is Bank. Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
The financial heart of the country.
The City.
The City.
Welcome to In the City.
Stand clear of the doors, please.
Welcome to In the City. Each week we unpack a story that's crucial to the world's financial capitals. I'm Francine, Lacqua.
And I'm Allegra, Stratton. Well, Fran, can you believe it's only been 8 months since the change of government?
Back then it felt like a much simpler time for Keir Starmer and probably everyone else.
Back then, public support for Keir Starmer and his party was higher. The US election felt like a distant reality, and with a clear intent to reset relations with businesses, the Labour Party's promise of tangible improvements to Britain's quality of life felt achievable.
So here we are in March, popularity of the government slipping. Of course, we have the US President Donald Trump firmly in office, which brings its own challenges. And those key election pledges, well, are they on track, Allegra?
Well, indeedy. So we're going to try and answer that on In the City this week. And to do that, we've got the team here at Bloomberg who just in the last few days have published a scorecard on how the government's doing. And we've got the two brilliant minds who put it together, Phil Aldrick, senior UK economy reporter, and Dan Hanson, UK economist on the Bloomberg Economics team. So do we want to do methodology or not?
We want to do why the scorecard?
Why or not how?
We picked 5 key measures, basically the economic measures that the Labour government has set itself against. So there's the ambitions it has. It says it wants to have the highest growth in the G7, and they've put a nominal 2.5% annual growth rate on that. And they also have an additional one, which was raising living standards by real household disposable income per head. There's an 80% employment target. There's a pledge that we're going to have fiscal stability and economic stability. They're saying ending austerity, and they want to build 1.5 million homes. So we just took what their ambitions were, and then we said, how are they doing?
I mean, 8 months is a good time frame because it's 8 months into a 5-year fixed term parliament, and there's a lot going on.
Obviously, when you say in a 5-year term, you might argue it's probably a bit unfair to give them a mark at the moment, but actually these things, they are very stretching targets. I think that's the thing to sort of pick out with this. Perhaps raising living standards isn't a very stretching target, but 2.5% growth a year is a very stretching target. Building that many homes is a very stretching target. Obviously, Phil said about the employment target. These are all very, as I say, stretching things to achieve. And it's important, I think, that the government not just held account internally, but we're here to sort of cast our eye over it and look at these things. As you both said at the top of the show there, the world has changed dramatically. Now, they're going to have to adapt Labour as well as we go forward. But I think, at least the top line of this that Phil and I looked at, the sort of living standards piece, I mean, surely it's every government's goal to raise living standards over a parliament, right? And actually, when we looked at it, we think they'll probably do it, but it's not going to be as convincing as they'd like it to be, we don't think, at least.
That doesn't really matter, though, does it, if they've got a numerical increase?
No, I think it would matter, though, if they turned around in 2029 and said, yes, we've raised living standards, but it's not as fast as the last government.
Okay, yeah.
That was one of the big economic reasons, at least, why it didn't do particularly well in the election. So I think people want to feel richer, don't they? They don't just want to see a number higher. You want to actually feel like you've got
you're better off than you were 5 years ago.
Exactly.
Question.
And do you feel like there's more money in your pocket?
And also, I was struck at the growth event that Rachel Reeves did some weeks ago. I think you were there, Phil, is it Siemens factory, where she was asked, what is the metric? And she chose to say increase in living standards.
Yeah, it's effectively a downgrade in their ambitions because no government since records began in 1955 has failed to improve living standards. And so Dan's measure, he adjusts the OBR outlook for productivity to something which is a bit more in line with the consensus forecast. And on that measure, the forecast would suggest that they are going to have the smallest increase in living standards since 1955, which would be a failure, basically. If you deliver the smallest uplift in real living standards, that's not something to celebrate, is it?
Phil, I think for boosting growth and living standards, you gave them a 5 out of 10. And again, and this is also because basically, that you measure it by a real household disposable income per head. Why is it 5 out of 10? Why are they not doing better on that metric?
Because you're starting with just 8 months of the 5 years having gone. So you've got to look at what policies they're putting in place and make a judgment on what they've been able to achieve so far. And so the outlook is not particularly good if you take those measures just mentioned, but what they've done so far to boost growth. On the downside, one thing they're doing which doesn't help growth is the NICS rise, so the payroll tax, which obviously everyone is saying is damaging for growth. But on the upside, they've got this longer term plan to basically invest much more in public infrastructure. And the OBR did score that as a net growth enhancing investment. It takes time to deliver though, and that was something missing from the last few governments. They are delivering on that. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, which is why I kind of put them bang in the middle, basically.
I think that's important, the point that Phil's made about the timing. Time's not on their side with this because the policies they need to put in place just will not yield results immediately. So investing loads more, building bridges, building schools, they take time, and the economic benefits accruing from those things take a long time to come through. Planning reform as well is a really positive thing. If they're successful in doing it, it will be a positive thing. But sort of the cloud hanging over it all, as Phil just said again, is this NICS rise, which happens immediately. That's happening in April. And it's that balance between this sort of near-term cloud and actually this longer-term vision, which I think they've said a lot of good things and some of the right things, but time is just not on their side. So you have this really tricky balance between, and I think that's where the 5 out of 10 comes from, between this sort of doing the right things and waiting for them to reap benefits for the economy. That's a really tricky place to be.
How much, when you were both doing this, did you think that this is about them wanting to be a really 29 is the halfway point?
I think that's a really important point. When I write stuff, I think, what would an investor get from this note that I've just written, and what would they think? And I'd read it and think, maybe 2029 isn't a given for them in terms of, if you look at living standards, if they come to the electorate with that performance on living standards, maybe 2029 isn't a given for them. I think you're right, Allegra, though, that this is like a 10-year plan for them. That's how they view it. But if they've just
got to get re-elected.
Just a small matter.
That'll depend on growth and living standards.
Exactly, it's all interlinked.
Yeah.
And then if you're tacking to the right, for want of a better phrase, to try and head off reform /
Yeah, exactly.
Because a lot of those new MPs they've got are in traditional, I mean, there's nothing traditional anymore, but they're doing a bunch of shape-shifting right now in order to head off that reform threat, if indeed it is a threat, because obviously there's a lot going on with the Reform Party right now. Mm-hmm. It's just they've got to, at that 29, they've got to keep a large number of the huge landslide they have right now.
Yeah, they do. It's really interesting you're saying tacking to the right, defence spending. We're going to hear about potentially welfare cuts in the next week or so. They aren't classic Labour policies at all. One thing I have heard from people is, what do they really stand for? What's the strategy? Is it supply side reform? Is it classic Labour sort of tax and spend policy? And it feels like it's a bit of everything at the moment. And there's a real question mark about the sort of overall strategy. All of that said, I think going back to the score, the 5 out of 10, I think they've done some sensible things. They're just going to take time to come through.
And Phil, that's kind of what the budget felt like in the autumn, that it was a bit throw everything at it and see what sticks. Are they going to change? I know a lot of it is on regulation. If you look at financial and planning regulation, will that be torn up to finally unleash the animal spirits they're talking about?
Well, bonfire of the regulations, yeah. That's certainly the way they're going. They did always say that they were going to make us a better regulated country, and they are pushing ahead with that. I think the planning reforms, we all knew that they were going to really try and push through a complete supply side shift on the planning.
Yeah, we did loads of podcasts before the election about it,
and they are delivering that. And actually, one of our scores, our top 7 out of 10 is the 1.5 million homes. It's a stretch target. They're never going to get to 1.5 million, but I think they know that. But they're pushing for that, and they get 1.2. That would be a massive success, and so that would be huge. And what they're doing on planning, just simplifying some of the environmental measures, removing the right for smaller quangos to interfere in the planning process, CPO with no hope value. So if your land is just a piece of derelict land, you can't claim it to have residential value. So there's all sorts of things in there, new towns commitments. There's all sorts of things in there which everyone in the policy world says this is what needs to be done. Will they get it through all unchanged with no legislative adjustments? Then that's a big test. But fundamentally what they've done is so far has been pretty good. So the general bonfire of regulations is, some of it feels a little bit like they're just desperately trying to claw any kind of growth measure. They want to send this message that we are the growth party, and it feels like they're trying to fix the problems created by the budget, where we had lingering fiscal uncertainty, which raises the prospect of further growth damaging tax rises down the line. They need to get growth going. Some of these things you would not have expected, like Heathrow, you never would have expected that. And then financial deregulation, they're pushing hard on that and other areas. You can see the idea behind it.
I also see a 1 out of 10.
There is a 1
I mean,
out
that's
of
10.
terrifying. 1 out of 10.
But yes, employment only gets a 1 out of 10. That's because they said it's 80% employment target, which would require 2 million people currently aged between 16 and 64 to be moving into work now, effectively, to get...
Which is tricky when you have made employment more expensive.
And then the next, exactly, and the next cut. So if you're saying what policy have they done to help that, they've done a policy sort of completely antithetical to that. They've said, well, there's two things. They've raised the minimum wage, and so you can't pass this cost down in slower wage growth towards that. And obviously people just above the minimum wage are also going to have big increases in their wages to keep the differential going. And at the same time, you've passed the cost on to the employers. They can't pass much down through lower wages. So they've got to do more unemployment. You can just see economically that's how it's going to have to go. So you give them kind of nothing on policy levers to increase employment and not an awful lot on anything else. So the 80% also is so stretching. Only 5 countries in the world have it, and so it seems incredibly unlikely we're going to get there. But if it's a stretch target and we get to sort of 78, we'd all be celebrating.
I think in business, what do they call them? Big, hairy, audacious targets? Is it BHAGs? We had them in government all the time. So big, hairy, audacious goals. There's a thing, right?
Right. I don't know that one.
No, right. No, it was a Rishi Sunak thing. It may even have been a Matt Hancock thing, which was you have these targets, and then if you fall slightly short, then you've done better. I think they work in business. I'm not sure they work in politics, where your opponents can say, you fell short. You started this podcast by saying, I think I get it in business. I don't get it in politics. Do you think they regret the national insurance increase on employers?
They'd figured that they didn't have any choice.
The reason I'm asking is it does seem to be the kind of lead weight that's weighing on everything else.
I think, personally, they found this black hole. Yeah, it was later in July, wasn't it? They found this black hole. It feels to me like they could have turned around and said, this is consistent with the next cuts being unaffordable. Even if they'd done half of it on employee. And I know you're right, Phil, they would have broken their manifesto pledge, but they didn't know this black hole existed. What we're turning around and saying is this employee next cut's just not affordable. And then they could have split it between, even if they wanted to do a bit on employer next, it just wouldn't have been as bad.
So you've got the two issues, which is the business community feels totally betrayed, very, very angry. These taxes are going to be passed in large part through to prices and to, smaller wage rises and higher unemployment. So there's some damage coming down the line from this. To repair the public finances, there was always going to be a difficult decision. They tied their hands too much beforehand, and they left themselves so little fiscal headroom. This belief that they were establishing economic stability with the October budget has been proved demonstrably not to be the case, because they're coming back in 6 months and they're having to do welfare cuts, they're having to do public spending cuts because they just need to re-establish some headroom.
So Dan, what's the way forward for them?
There are sort of 3 elements in this upcoming fiscal event that we're going to I think that are worth watching. One is, how much is the OBR going to change its forecast? Because that, I think at least, is a source of some of the concern around the UK's fiscal position, the optimism in the OBR's forecast. So when investors look at it, they're like, you know what, you're going to borrow a lot more than the OBR says you're going to borrow because growth's not going to be as strong. The second thing is, obviously, how big a fiscal hole does that leave? And how much does Rachel Reeves think she needs to repair the public finances? Because, as Phil's just said, £10 billion in terms of headroom is just peanuts. And we are now in a much more volatile world than we were in October. We're in a much more volatile world, so we need much more headroom. And then 3 is, it's the policy lever that you pull. So is it benefit spending? Do you run the gauntlet on spending cuts again and do what Jeremy Hunt did and pencil spending cuts in at the end of the forecast?
Just not many options for them, though, are there?
This is the issue, that on departmental spending, the plans are already so tight they can't go further. Benefit spending, yeah, there's some stuff you can do there, but it's not very Labour-like. And then you got tax rises, which they just don't want to talk about. The last one is more borrowing, but they know what's going to happen in terms of how the market's going to respond to that. So I don't envy them.
Something's got to give.
Something has got to...
You used to work in the Treasury, didn't you, Dan?
I did.
What would you do, Dan?
What would I do? I'd raise taxes.
Would you have done it in July? Well, in the last fiscal event.
I say that as a sort of...
Easy peasy.
Yeah, well, I don't say that as a politician. I say that as a being just completely analytical about it. And there are things they can do, like, the freezes on the personal allowances, they can continue to put, and that raises them. And people don't feel that in their pocket right now. It's one of these, it's a bit like cutting spending in the future. It's one of these that you just delay the difficult decision. But actually, it feels like taxes are the only thing that really you can do. The other thing you can do, of course, is decide to completely change what public service provision looks like. Think about the NHS, think about not education, well, they've chosen on defence, but the NHS in particular. Does the NHS have to just look different going forward? There is a huge question around that. But as things stand, if they're not willing to really change how things look in the NHS, then everyone's just going to have to pay more tax. And I know that's not a particularly positive message, but that's the world we find ourselves in. And that's not just a UK specific thing either. That's a pan-European question that is hanging over every government now with what's going on with defence spending. It's a really tricky situation, but I think the world has changed dramatically since October, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Rachel Reeves perceives what needs to be done with UK fiscal policy to make sure it's able to stand up to this volatility and shocks.
Phil, Dan, thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
No problem at all.
Thanks for listening to this week's In the City from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Francine Lacqua, and Allegra Stratton. It was produced by Summer Sadi and Moses Andam, with sound design by Blake Maples. Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer. Special thanks to Phil Aldrick and Dan Hanson. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts.